So, how does a brand new country, a total upstart, become a global superpower in less than 200 years? Well, the story of the United States is packed with traumatic rises and absolutely devastating conflicts. But to really get it, we've got to go back way further than you might think.
At its heart, this is a nation built on a total paradox, right? You have this incredible dream of a better life that pulled in millions of immigrants, but at the same time, a reality of constant conflict, from the fight for its own independence to the deep, deep divisions that challenge it even today. So, how are we going to break this all down? First, we'll look at the ancient civilizations that were here long before anyone else. Then, we'll get into the fiery birth of the nation. After that, we'll see how the country was literally torn in two by a civil war, and then watch its incredible rise to become a global power. And finally, we'll ask the big question: what's next for this incredibly complex nation?
Okay, so our story doesn't start with colonists on ships. It starts with the people who had lived here for thousands of years. Long before the first European sails were spotted on the horizon, this continent was already home to a rich and amazing tapestry of cultures.
Just try to imagine a world connected by a massive bridge of ice. That's how the first people are thought to have walked into the Americas. And over thousands of years, they built these incredibly diverse and honestly sophisticated societies. And we're not talking about simple tribes here. You had the Mississippians building these huge cities, and the Iroquois creating a complex democratic government that would, believe it or not, later influence the founders of the U.S.
Now, the first Europeans to show up were actually the Vikings, way back. But it was Columbus's voyage in 1492 that completely changed the game. Suddenly, the race was on. The French were after furs, the Dutch were after profits, and then in 1607, the English finally put down permanent roots in Jamestown. And that was the beginning of everything changing.
But this new chapter for some, well, it meant a devastating end for others. See, the Europeans brought more than just guns. They brought diseases that the native peoples had absolutely no immunity to. And the result was a catastrophe on a scale that's just hard to even imagine. Some estimates put the population decline at 90%. It's a really stark reminder of the huge human cost of this period. So, out of this chaotic mix of cultures and clashing ambitions, something totally new started to take shape. A unique identity, born in this new world, that would eventually lead a bunch of mismatched colonies to do the unthinkable, take on the entire British Empire.
So how did it all go wrong so fast? Well, it started with money, as things often do. Britain was buried in debt from a huge war and figured the American colonies should help pay for it. But it wasn't just about the taxes themselves. It was about who had the power. The colonists' rallying cry, "No taxation without representation," was a direct shot at British authority. Every protest, every clash, like the tragic Boston Massacre, just pushed them further and further apart until there was no turning back. The fuse was officially lit.
The tension just kept building until the colonies had to make a choice. And in the summer of 1776, they took this enormous leap of faith. Guided by the powerful words of Thomas Jefferson, they declared themselves free and independent states. And you have to understand, this wasn't just some political document. It was a declaration of war against the most powerful empire on the planet.
The fight for independence was, to put it mildly, a long shot. The American forces were on the verge of collapse again and again, until a shocking victory at Saratoga changed everything. It was the proof the world needed that this rebellion might actually work, and it was enough to convince France to jump in on the American side. With a major new ally, the tide finally turned, leading to that decisive surrender at Yorktown that won America its freedom.
Okay, so winning the war is one thing. Building a nation from scratch, that's a whole different challenge. The new states came together and created this radical new system of government, and they wrote it all down in the Constitution. And to lead this bold new experiment, they turned to the one person they all trusted, George Washington, the hero of the war who became the very first president of the United States.
So this young nation was growing at a crazy pace, but there was a poison just running through its veins. The institution of slavery, a brutal contradiction to everything the country claimed to stand for, was a ticking time bomb that was about to explode into the deadliest war in American history.
And this slide really just lays out the massive gap that was opening up. You had the North, where an industrial revolution was kicking off, building cities and factories, and then you had the South, which was still a farming economy, completely dependent on the brutal system of slavery. These weren't just two different economies, they were basically two different worlds on a collision course.
And what was fueling all this westward expansion was this powerful and frankly dangerous idea called manifest destiny, the belief that America was destined by God to stretch from one coast to the other. It led to huge land grabs, sure, but it also came at a horrific price, like the forced march of native tribes on the Trail of Tears. And with every new piece of land, that same toxic question kept coming up. Will this be a free state or a slave state?
The election of 1860 was the spark. When Abraham Lincoln won, on a platform that said no more expansion of slavery, the South saw it as a direct threat to their entire way of life. So South Carolina did the unthinkable and seceded from the Union, and then the dominoes just started to fall, one after another. The House divided was finally collapsing.
The Civil War was a whole new kind of hell. It was really the first modern war, where the factories of the North went up against the fierce fighting spirit of the South. The scale of the death and destruction was just unimaginable. The Battle of Gettysburg, a 3-day slaughter, was the absolute peak of the Confederate effort and became the brutal turning point of the entire war.
After 4 long, brutal years, the fighting finally stopped. The Union was saved, and slavery was at last abolished. But any joy from the victory was cut short. Just days later, Abraham Lincoln, the man who had guided the country through its darkest moment, was assassinated. It was this cruel, tragic blow that cast a long, dark shadow over the incredibly difficult road to recovery that was just beginning.
So, out of the ashes of the Civil War, a new America started to rise up, a nation that had been reforged in fire and was now ready to step onto the world stage. The 20th century would be a time of incredible power and influence for the U.S., a period that people started calling the American century.
And the American century was an absolute roller coaster. The U.S. became a key player in World War I, then dove headfirst into the wild parties of the Roaring '20s, only to be hit by the crushing despair of the Great Depression. Then, the shock attack on Pearl Harbor pulled America into another massive world war, a war that ended with the terrifying flash of atomic bombs, kicking off a brand new and very uncertain age.
You know, the end of World War II didn't really bring peace. It just started a new kind of war, a cold one. The world was now split down the middle, between 2 nuclear-armed superpowers with completely opposite ideas about how the world should work. You had the United States on one side, with capitalism and democracy, facing off against the Soviet Union and its communist allies. The Cold War was this high-stakes game for the future of the planet that could have ended in total annihilation at any moment.
The Cold War was fought in the shadows, with spies and through smaller wars in other countries, but it was also a war of ideas, a race to see which system was better. This rivalry is what pushed humanity all the way to the moon, an absolutely stunning achievement. But while America was reaching for the stars, it was also being forced to deal with the ugly injustice at home. The Civil Rights Movement, led by the incredible Martin Luther King Jr., was a powerful fight to make the country live up to its own promises of freedom and equality for everyone.
When the Berlin Wall came down, it really seemed like a new era of peace was on the way. But, well, the 21st century brought a whole new set of challenges, forcing America to face its own vulnerabilities and figure out its place in a world that was changing faster than ever.
On a clear Tuesday morning in September, the world changed forever. The 9/11 attacks were a brutal, shocking assault right at the heart of America. They completely shattered the nation's feeling of safety and plunged it into a strange and new kind of war. A global fight against an enemy that didn't have an army or even a country.
You know, the American story is still being written. It's this grand and often very messy experiment. It's a story of incredible achievements and also profound failures, of a nation that's always struggling to live up to its own ideals. So as we look ahead, the big question is still out there. What is the next chapter in the American story?